Lunch costs about $15. A sandwich, a drink, a cookie if the morning went badly. Hold that number in your head, because here is a shopping list. 1 wooden bucket, 1 soup kettle, 1 black pig, 1 stray dog, 1 wooden pole, 1 tray of pastries, and 1 human ear. Every single item on that list started a war. Not a metaphorical war, not a trade dispute, not a strongly worded letter. Actual wars, with declarations and warships and treaties and, in a couple of cases, tens of thousands of corpses. The pig is the only item that costs more than a decent burrito, and we will get to the pig, because the pig has opinions. What makes these worth the next 20 minutes is not that people are dumb. People are dumb. That is not news, and it is not interesting. The interesting part is that in every one of these stories, the object was never actually the point. The object was the excuse. Empires spend decades stacking up grudges, filing every insult, never quite throwing any of them out, and then one afternoon, somebody's livestock wanders into the wrong garden, and the whole pile comes down at once. 7 of them, cheapest first, deadliest last. Keep a running tally of what humanity has been willing to spend on things you could replace with 1 trip to a hardware store, because the final number is significantly worse than you are expecting. Also, nobody ever paid the bill. Watch for that. It becomes a theme. 1 shot, 1 kettle. On the 8th of October, 1784, a Dutch warship called the Dolfijn spotted 3 ships coming down the River Scheldt near a flooded stretch of marshland called Sijftinge. The lead vessel was a merchantman named Louis, and she was flying the personal colors of Joseph II, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, the Austrian Netherlands, and an ego that required its own postal code. The Dolfijn ran up a signal telling Louis to stop. Louis did not stop. The Dutch captain, who had orders and a very clear understanding of what happens to men who ignore orders, gave the command to fire a single gun. The shot crossed the water, punched through the air above the deck of Louis, and struck a soup kettle. That was it. That was the entire naval engagement. 1 cannonball, 1 iron pot full of the crew's dinner, now redistributed across the planking. The captain of Louis immediately struck his colors and surrendered his ship to a nation he had been ordered to humiliate. The Dutch boarded, took the vessel as a prize, and towed it away while the Austrian sailors presumably tried to work out how they were going to explain this in the report. The Dutch, who have a gift for this kind of thing, named the resulting conflict the Ketteloorlog, the Kettle War. Some records call it the Marmiet Noorlog, from the French word for a cooking pot, which somehow makes it worse. 2 European powers with a combined population in the millions went to war, and the only confirmed casualty was soup. Now, obviously, 1 cannonball does not launch a war on its own. You need a river, a dead city, a bankrupt empire, and about 200 years of accumulated resentment first. But the beauty of the Kettle War is how perfectly the ridiculous surface matches the ridiculous depths. Joseph II sent those ships specifically to be shot at. He wanted an incident. He got an incident, and the incident was a ruined pot of stew, and the entire continent laughed at him for the rest of his reign. The kettle itself did not survive. Nobody thought to preserve it, which is a genuine loss to European museum culture. There should be a room somewhere with a dented iron pot on a velvet cushion and a plaque reading, "Sole Casualty, Austro-Dutch War of 1784. It is worth appreciating just how carefully staged this was. Joseph did not send a fleet. He sent a merchant ship with a flag on it, escorted by a couple of vessels, and pointed it at a river he knew was guarded. The whole operation was designed to produce exactly one of 2 outcomes. Either the Dutch let the ship through, in which case the blockade was finished and the Scheldt was open, or the Dutch fired on the imperial flag, in which case Joseph had a legal insult worth going to war over. It was a lawyer's provocation dressed up as a shipping venture. The problem with staging a provocation is that you do not get to control the tone. Joseph wanted headlines about Dutch aggression against the sacred person of the emperor. What he got was a punchline that crossed Europe faster than any diplomatic dispatch, because every court on the continent immediately understood that the Great Habsburg challenge to Dutch naval power had been stopped by 1 shot into the galley. Pamphleteers in Amsterdam had a wonderful few months. Cartoons went around. The joke essentially wrote itself, and it stuck so hard that nearly 250 years later, the official name of a real declared war between 2 real states is still a reference to cookware. There is a version of this where Joseph is a strategic genius who forced a diplomatic solution at almost 0 cost in blood. That version exists, historians make it, and it is not wrong. It is just very difficult to hold that thought in your head while also holding the image of a Habsburg captain surrendering his ship because somebody shot his lunch. The river everybody wanted. To understand why anyone cared about a boat on a river, you need to understand what the Dutch had done to Antwerp, which is one of the longest and pettiest acts of economic strangulation in European history. Antwerp sits on the Scheldt, roughly 50 miles inland from the North Sea. In the 1500s, it was the richest port in northern Europe, a place where Portuguese spice ships unloaded next to English wool merchants and German bankers who charged all of them interest. Then came the Dutch Revolt, and in 1585, Antwerp fell to Spanish forces while the rebellious northern provinces held the river mouth. The northerners, being practical people, simply closed the river. They did not attack Antwerp, they did not besiege it. They just parked themselves at the mouth of the Scheldt and made it illegal for seagoing ships to sail up to the city. Every cargo bound for Antwerp had to be unloaded downstream, transferred to smaller boats, and taxed by the Dutch on the way through. The trade drained north to Amsterdam, which is precisely where the Dutch wanted it, and Antwerp went from the beating heart of European commerce to a very handsome town with an enormous cathedral and nothing to do. The Treaty of Munster in 1648 made the closure permanent and legal. The Dutch had written their competitors' death sentence into international law, and everyone signed it. Antwerp stayed shut for the next 2 centuries. By the 1780s, that arrangement had passed to Joseph II, who inherited the Austrian Netherlands, looked at his brand new territory, and noticed that its greatest asset had been in a medically induced coma since before his great-great-grandparents were born. Joseph was a reformer, an Enlightenment enthusiast, and a man who genuinely believed that if a rule was stupid, you should simply announce that it no longer applied. He abolished serfdom, he shut down monasteries, he issued something like 6,000 decrees in 10 years, and personally reviewed a shocking number of them. So in 1784 he made his demands. Tear down the barrier fortresses, the chain of forts where Dutch garrisons had sat inside Austrian territory for decades, hand back the disputed lands of the Overmaas, evacuate Maastricht, and open the Scheldt. The Dutch Republic, which had just been comprehensively beaten up by the British in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War and was in no condition to fight anybody, said no. Joseph, reading the room and concluding it was empty, decided to test whether they meant it. He had reason to think they were bluffing. The Republic in 1784 was a mess. The war with Britain had gutted the navy, wrecked the merchant fleet, and exposed the Dutch as a former superpower running on fumes and reputation. The country was splitting into 2 furious political camps, the patriots and the supporters of the Prince of Orange, who would be openly fighting each other in the streets within 3 years. A confident empire looking at that situation would reasonably conclude that a firm shove would produce a collapse. What Joseph missed is the thing that outsiders always miss about the Dutch, which is that a nation built on the principle that the sea itself can be told no, does not respond well to being told what to do with its rivers. The Scheldt closure was not a policy to them. It was the load-bearing wall of Amsterdam's entire economy, guaranteed by treaty, defended for 200 years, and worth more to them than the price of a short war they were fairly sure somebody else would talk them out of. So, when the imperial ships came down the river, the men on the Dolphin were not improvising. They had orders. Those orders had been debated by the States General, and the entire chain of command already knew what the answer was going to be. The only question was who would shoot first and what they would hit. 2 million guilders later, he sent the ships to be fired on, and he got his wish, and then he had to deal with what came next, which was nothing. On the 30th of October, 1784, 3 weeks after the Kettle died, Joseph II formally declared war. The states of Holland began organizing forces on the 18th of November. Troops moved toward the border. Officers made plans. Everyone waited for the campaign to start. The campaign never started. What Joseph had failed to account for was France. Louis XVI's government had spent the previous decade cultivating the Dutch as a counterweight to Britain, had no interest in watching Austria devour them, and had a foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, who could see exactly where this was heading. France offered to mediate. Both sides, neither of whom actually wanted a war they could not afford, accepted with the enthusiasm of men being talked out of a bar fight by a friend who has kindly appeared at the right moment. The Treaty of Fontainebleau was signed in November 1785. The terms were almost aggressively anticlimactic. The Scheldt stayed closed. Antwerp stayed dead. Joseph got a strip of territory, a formal Dutch withdrawal from a few forts, and a cash settlement whose size depends entirely on which historian you trust. Some sources put it around 2 million guilders. Others push it as high as 10 million. What is not disputed is that France quietly paid a large chunk of it out of its own treasury to make the problem go away, which is a detail worth sitting with, because France was about 4 years from discovering it had no money left at all. Joseph II died in 1790, having accomplished almost nothing he set out to do. His own epitaph, which he wrote, described him as a man who failed in everything he undertook. Historians have been arguing about whether that is fair for 230 years, and the Kettle War is not helping his case. Antwerp finally got its river back in 1792, when French revolutionary armies rolled through and reopened the Scheldt by the simple method of no longer caring what the Treaty of Munster said. It took a revolution, a continental war, and the collapse of the entire old order of Europe to undo what one cannon shot could not. And then everyone discovered why the Dutch had bothered in the first place. Napoleon looked at the reopened city and reportedly described Antwerp as a pistol pointed at the heart of England. he poured money into the docks. The British spent the next decade trying to work out how to destroy them, eventually launching the Walcheren expedition in 1809, which put 40,000 men ashore in the Scheldt estuary and lost roughly 4,000 of them, almost all to malaria, without ever reaching the city. Antwerp is now one of the largest ports in Europe, which suggests everybody involved was correct about its value and wrong about nearly everything else. There is one more thing about Joseph II that makes the Kettle War funnier in retrospect. 5 years after Fontainebleau, the Austrian Netherlands revolted against him anyway. His reforms had managed to offend the clergy, the nobility, the guilds, and the ordinary population all at once, which takes a real talent. In 1789, the provinces declared independence as the United Belgian States. He had gone to war to enrich a territory that then tried to fire him. Line item 1. One soup kettle. Cost: several million guilders and the dignity of a Holy Roman Emperor. The kettle itself was probably worth about a day's wages for a ship's cook. The pig ate the potatoes. On the morning of June 15, 1859, an American farmer named Lyman Cutler walked out onto his land on San Juan Island and found a large black boar eating his potatoes. Again, this was not the pig's first offense. The animal belonged to Charles Griffin, an Irishman who ran the Hudson's Bay Company sheep farm that covered most of the island, and Griffin's livestock had been treating Cutler's garden as a buffet for weeks. Cutler had complained. Griffin had not especially cared. So Cutler went back inside, got his rifle, and shot the pig. Then, because he was not a monster, he went to find Griffin and offered to pay for it. $10, which in 1859 was real money for a farmer, and more than a fair price for one hog. Griffin wanted 100. The exchange that supposedly followed is the most famous thing about this entire war, and it is almost certainly too good to be true. Cutler said the pig was eating his potatoes. Griffin replied that it was up to Cutler to keep his potatoes out of the pig. Historians have never found a contemporary source for that line, and it smells strongly of something invented later by somebody who understood how a story should go. It is still the perfect summary of the situation, which is probably why it refuses to die. What is documented is the escalation. Griffin refused the $10. British authorities on the island threatened to arrest Cutler and haul him to Vancouver Island for trial, which the Americans regarded as an outrage because in their view, the British had no jurisdiction on San Juan Island at all. And here is where a dead hog stops being a neighborly dispute and starts being an international incident, because nobody actually knew who owned the island. The Treaty of Oregon, signed in June 1846, had settled the Great Oregon Boundary Crisis. The line would run west along the 49th parallel, then turn south through the middle of the channel, separating the mainland from Vancouver Island, then out to sea through the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Two very reasonable diplomats wrote that sentence, shook hands, and went home. The problem is that there is no such thing as the channel. There are two. Haro Strait runs west of the San Juan Islands. Rosario Strait runs east of them. Between those two channels sits an archipelago of a few hundred islands, and depending on which channel you pick, every one of them is either American or British. Both governments, entirely predictably, picked the channel that gave them the islands. Both were sincerely convinced they were right. And for 13 years nobody pushed the issue, because the only things on San Juan Island were sheep, potatoes, and roughly 18 American settlers who had cheerfully staked claims on the best grazing land the Hudson's Bay Company had. Then somebody shot a pig, and the diplomatic ambiguity that everyone had been politely ignoring since 1846 came due all at once. 64 men, one boar. The American settlers, sensing that Cutler was about to get arrested by a foreign power on what they considered American soil, sent a petition to Brigadier General William S. Harney, commander of the Department of Oregon. Harney was the worst possible person to receive this letter. He was a career soldier with a temper, a documented hatred of the British, and a habit of interpreting his orders in whatever way produced the most action. He read the petition, decided that American citizens were in danger, and dispatched troops without waiting to hear from Washington, which was several weeks of mail away, and therefore unable to stop him. On July 27, 1859, Captain George Pickett came ashore near Griffin Bay with Company D of the 9th Infantry, 64 men, against the British Empire. Pickett, who had graduated dead last in his West Point class and never once let it slow him down, planted his little force in front of the Hudson's Bay dock and issued a proclamation declaring the island American territory. When it became clear that the Royal Navy was on its way, he is supposed to have said that he would make a Bunker Hill of it. Governor James Douglas of Vancouver Island, who had spent his career with the Hudson's Bay Company and took the loss of company property personally, ordered the Navy to remove them. HMS Tribune arrived with 31 guns under Captain Jeffrey Phipps Hornby. HMS Satellite and HMS Plumper joined her. 3 warships, anchored in the bay, pointed at 64 infantrymen. Hornby was ordered to land Royal Marines and evict the Americans. He looked at the situation and declined, on the grounds that firing the first shot in a war between Britain and the United States over a garden dispute was above his pay grade and possibly above everybody's, the Americans reinforced. Lieutenant Colonel Silas Casey arrived on August 10 with 171 more men. By the end of the month, there were 461 American troops on the island with 14 field cannons, plus 8 enormous 32-pounder naval guns pulled off the USS Massachusetts and dragged up onto a bluff overlooking the harbor. The officer who supervised the placement of those guns was a young engineer named Henry Martin Robert. He would spend the rest of his career building fortifications and harbors, and then, after being humiliated at a chaotic church meeting he had been asked to chair, he would sit down and write a small book about how to run an orderly meeting. That book is Robert's Rules of Order. The man who invented the motion to table spent the summer of 1859 aiming cannons at the Royal Navy because of a pig. The British answered with everything they had in the region. 5 warships, 70 guns, 2,140 men. That is the actual scale of this thing. Over 2,600 armed men, and nearly 100 pieces of artillery, arranged in a firing position on a potato island, because a hog got into a garden. The man who stopped it was Rear Admiral Robert Lambert Baines, commander of the Royal Navy's Pacific Station, who arrived, was briefed on the situation, and refused Douglas outright. He would not, he said, involve 2 great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig. That sentence is why nobody died. One admiral, in a bad mood, declining to be an idiot. 12 years of nothing. When word finally reached Washington, President James Buchanan reacted with the specific horror of a man discovering that his own general had nearly started a war with the world's largest empire, without asking. He sent General Winfield Scott to fix it. Scott was 73, weighed somewhere north of 300 pounds, and was the most senior officer in the United States Army. He took 6 weeks to cross the continent, which turned out to be exactly the right speed, because by the time he arrived in October, everyone had been standing in the rain long enough to lose interest in dying. Scott negotiated with Douglas and produced a compromise that is, honestly, kind of beautiful. Neither country would give up its claim. Both would keep a token force on the island. 1 company each, no more than 100 men per side, until the diplomats sorted it out. Harney was formally rebuked and shipped off to a posting where he could not do this again. The Royal Marines built English camp on Garrison Bay in March 1860. The Americans built American camp on the windswept southern tip of the island, which, in a small act of cosmic justice, was the worst location by a wide margin. Then came 12 years of the least warlike joint military occupation in recorded history. The 2 garrisons became friends. They visited each other constantly. They held athletic competitions, horse races, and shooting matches. The British, who had picked the sheltered end of the island and had a proper garden and a genuinely excellent supply of liquor, hosted most of the parties. The Americans, freezing on their exposed prairie, attended with enthusiasm. Christmas and the 4th of July were both celebrated by everyone. Officers from both camps went hunting together. When a British Marine died, the Americans sent a delegation to the funeral. Back in the real world, the United States spent 4 of those years tearing itself apart in the Civil War, and the men on San Juan Island kept holding their picnics. Captain Pickett, incidentally, left in 1861 to join the Confederacy. He is now remembered almost entirely for one afternoon at Gettysburg in July 1863 when he sent roughly 12,500 men across open ground into the center of the Union line and watched more than half of them fall in under an hour. The man who declared he would make a Bunker Hill of San Juan Island got his real battle eventually, and it cost him his division. The pig dispute outlasted him. In 1871, the Treaty of Washington finally sent the whole question to arbitration, and the arbitrator chosen was Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany, who had absolutely nothing to do with any of it, and was presumably delighted to be asked. He handed it to a 3-man commission which sat in Geneva for nearly a year, reading treaty documents from 1846. On October 21, 1872, they ruled for the United States. The boundary would run through Haro Strait. The San Juan Islands were American. The Royal Marines packed up and sailed away on November 25, 1872. The last American troops left in July 1874. Total human casualties across 13 years, 2 military occupations, 5 warships, and 1 international arbitration. 0. Line item 2. 1 black boar, market value $10, refused. The island it settled is now full of vacation homes. A bucket goes missing. Here is the story every Italian schoolchild gets told. And it is wonderful, and we are going to have to take it apart afterward. In 1325, a handful of Modenese soldiers slipped over the border into Bolognese territory at night, crept up to a public well, and stole the bucket. 1 oak bucket, on a rope, of the kind used by anyone who wanted water. They carried it home to Modena and hung it up as a trophy. Bologna demanded it back. Modena said no. Bologna, a city of roughly 50,000 people with one of the oldest universities in the world, and a genuine claim to being the intellectual capital of northern Italy, responded to this insult by raising the largest army it had assembled in living memory and marching on its neighbor. That is the legend. It has been repeated for 700 years, it is on plaques and in guidebooks and in at least one opera, and the honest historical answer is that it is almost certainly backwards. What the records actually show is that Modena had taken the Bolognese castle of Montevideo, which is a normal and serious act of war involving a fortress rather than kitchenware. Bologna went to war over the castle. The bucket, according to the surviving sources, was carried off by the Modenese after the fighting as loot, along with everything else that was not nailed down. So the war did not start over a bucket. The bucket was the receipt, which, honestly, does not make the story less insane. Because a city fought a pitched battle, lost thousands of men, and the single object that has survived in the public memory for 7 centuries is a wooden pail somebody grabbed on the way out. The context underneath all of this is the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, which is the longest-running and least comprehensible feud in medieval Europe. In theory, the Guelphs supported the Pope and the Ghibellines supported the Holy Roman Emperor. In practice, by the 1300s, the labels had come loose from anything resembling a principle. If your rival city was Guelph, you were Ghibelline. If your family's rivals in your own city were Guelph, you were Ghibelline. The Guelphs of Florence split into black Guelphs and white Guelphs and started exiling each other, which is how Dante Alighieri ended up writing the greatest poem in the Italian language from other people's houses. Bologna was Guelph. Modena was Ghibelline. They are 25 miles apart. They had been at each other's throats for over a century, and they would keep going, in various forms, until 1529. The bucket did not cause that. The bucket just gave it a name. It helps to understand what northern Italy actually was in the 1300s, because it was not a country and it was barely a region. It was a scatter of independent city-states, each one governing a chunk of surrounding farmland it called its contado, each one convinced that its neighbor 20 miles down the road was a nest of thieves. These cities had constitutions, treasuries, guilds, universities, and standing grudges that were passed down through families the way other people pass down furniture. They hired mercenary captains. They built towers inside their own walls so that rival families could shoot at each other without leaving the neighborhood. Bologna had over 100 of those towers at one point. 2 of them are still standing, leaning at angles that will make your stomach drop if you look up at them for too long. In that environment, a border was not a line on a map. It was a wound that never closed. Villages changed hands every few years. Castles were taken and retaken and burned in between. Any given decade produced a dozen incidents that could reasonably be described as the cause of the next war, and which one got remembered came down mostly to which one made the better story. A bucket makes a fantastic story. A castle at Montevideo makes a footnote. 2 Hours at Zappolino. Bologna's army was enormous. The figures that come down to us put it around 32,000 men, roughly 30,000 on foot and 2,000 mounted, drawn from the city and its allies. Medieval numbers are always suspect and you should mentally discount them, but even a heavily shaved version of that force was a serious undertaking for a single Italian commune. Their commander was Fulcieri de Calboli, and he is worth pausing on, because he is one of those figures who wandered out of history and into literature. Fulcieri had served as Podesta of Florence in 1303, where he conducted a campaign against the white Guelphs so brutal that Dante put him into the Purgatorio in a prophecy describing him as a hunter driving terrified wolves through the streets, selling them alive and then butchering them. Getting a personalized cameo in the Divine Comedy as a metaphorical wolf butcher is a level of reputation most war criminals can only dream of. In 1325 he was captain of the people in Bologna, which meant this army was his. Facing him at Zappolino, in November 1325, Modena had about 7,000 men, roughly 5,000 foot and 2,000 horse, under Rinaldo Bonacolsi, the Lord of Mantua, universally known by the nickname Passerino, which means little sparrow. Do the arithmetic. Bologna outnumbered Modena somewhere between 4 and 5 to 1. On paper, this was not a battle, it was a formality. The fighting lasted about 2 hours. Modena's cavalry, which was proportionally far stronger and considerably better led, went through the Bolognese line and kept going. The larger army broke. Estimates of the losses vary considerably depending on the chronicle, but the figures usually given are around 2,500 Bolognese dead or wounded against roughly 500 on the Modenese side. Some accounts put it closer to 1,000 apiece. Whatever the exact number, thousands of men died in a field in Emilia in an afternoon, which is more people than lived in most towns in Europe at the time. Then the Modenese did something so perfectly Italian that it deserves its own monument. They chased the survivors all the way back to Bologna, 15 miles, right up to the city walls. They did not attempt to storm the place, because storming a city that size with 7,000 tired men would have been suicide. Instead, in full view of the defenders on the ramparts, they staged a palio, A horse race, a festival. They ran their own athletic games in the fields outside the gates, while the entire population of Bologna watched from the walls, having just lost a battle they should have won by a factor of 5. They also went to work on the countryside. Castles were burned, the sluice gates controlling the Reno River were wrecked, and Bologna's water supply took a serious hit. Then, on their way out, according to the sources, they stopped at a well and took the bucket. That is the moment. Not a daring midnight raid, a victorious army helping itself to a piece of municipal hardware on the walk home. As a joke, the bucket is still there. The really impressive part is what happened over the following 700 years, which is nothing. Nobody gave it back. The bucket went into Modena, and Modena kept it, and Modena is keeping it right now. It sits in the Torre della Ghirlandina, the leaning bell tower next to the cathedral, with a copy on public display in the town hall so tourists have something to look at. An actual medieval oak bucket, carefully conserved, humidity-controlled, treated by a modern Italian city as a national treasure because it was stolen from Bologna, and Bologna cannot have it. Bologna has never entirely let this go. There is a long tradition of Bolognese officials making pointed remarks about it, and Modenese officials responding with the civic equivalent of holding the bucket over their head and saying, "Come and get it." The choice of hiding place is its own small masterpiece of civic spite. The Ghirlandina is Modena's bell tower, nearly 90 meters of white marble attached to a cathedral that is on the UNESCO World Heritage List, one of the most important Romanesque buildings in Europe. Modena put the bucket in there, not in a storeroom, not in a municipal archive. In the tower, alongside the city's most sacred architecture, at the exact spiritual center of the town. That is not preservation. That is a message, delivered continuously, for 700 years, to a city 25 miles away. In 1622, the poet Alessandro Tassoni turned the whole affair into a mock-heroic epic called La Secchia Rapita, the Stolen Bucket, in which gods descend from Olympus to take sides in a war between two Italian towns over a piece of well equipment. It was a hit. It essentially invented an entire genre of comic epic, and influenced Alexander Pope's Rape of the Lock. In 1772, Antonio Salieri, the composer whose main historical job is now being unfairly accused of murdering Mozart, wrote an opera based on it. Think about that chain of events for a second. Thousands of men died in a field. Out of that came a poem, and out of that poem came a genre, and out of that genre came an opera, and the object at the center of all of it holds about 2 gallons of water. The Guelph and Ghibelline Wars ground on for another 200 years after Zappolino. Passerino Bonacalci, the winning commander, was murdered in 1328 by the Gonzaga family, who took Mantua from him and held it for the next 380 years. Fulcieri de Calboli, the losing commander, went on to serve as Podesta of Bologna and Faenza, and then faded out of the record, remembered mostly for the Dante cameo. Everybody involved is dust. The bucket is fine. Line item 3. 1 oak bucket, capacity roughly 2 gallons. Value at time of theft approximately nothing. Cost, somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 human lives, 1 wrecked water supply, and a grudge that is still running. The dog crossed the line. On the 18th of October, 1925, at a mountain pass called Demir Kapu on the slopes of Belasica, a Greek soldier's dog got loose. The pass sits directly on the Greek border with Bulgaria, in country so steep and so poorly marked that the exact line was a matter of local opinion. The dog, having no opinions about the Treaty of Neuilly, ran across it. The soldier, who did have opinions but liked his dog more, went after it. A Bulgarian sentry saw an armed foreign soldier crossing the frontier and shot him. That is the version that gave the whole thing its name, the War of the Stray Dog. It is charming, it is tragic, it fits neatly into a list like this one, and there is a real chance it did not happen. The Bulgarian account, and the Greek military account, describe something considerably less whimsical. In that telling, on the same day, Bulgarian troops crossed into Greek territory and attacked a Greek outpost on Belasica, killing a Greek captain and a sentry. No dog. Just a border shooting between two countries that had been shooting at each other on and off since 1913. There were no neutral witnesses. There is no film. Both governments produced accounts that made the other side responsible, and the dog appears in some contemporary reports and not others. Historians have never settled it, and probably never will, because the truth of what happened at that pass is buried under a century of national storytelling on both sides. What is beyond dispute is that a Greek captain died, and that within 4 days Greece had invaded a sovereign country. The reason this escalated so violently has nothing to do with dogs, and everything to do with the previous 12 years. Greece and Bulgaria had fought each other in the Second Balkan War in 1913. They had fought on opposite sides in the First World War. The Treaty of Neuilly in 1919 had stripped Bulgaria of Western Thrace, and with it any access to the Aegean Sea, which Bulgarians regarded as a national amputation, and Greeks regarded as the correct outcome. And the specific district where this happened, Petric, was not really governed by Bulgaria at all. It was effectively run by the internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization. a paramilitary group known as IMRO that collected its own taxes, ran its own courts, and launched raids across the Greek and Yugoslav borders whenever it felt like it. Sofia had nominal authority there and almost no practical control. The Bulgarian government was in the exquisitely awkward position of being blamed by its neighbors for violence it could not actually stop, so when a shot was fired at Demir Kapu, it landed in a region already full of armed men who did not answer to anybody. There is one more layer to this, and it is the saddest one. In 1919, Greece and Bulgaria had signed a convention on the voluntary exchange of populations, which was a diplomatic phrase covering something much uglier. Tens of thousands of Bulgarians left Greek, Macedonia, and Thrace. Tens of thousands of Greeks left Bulgaria. Many of them ended up in exactly the border districts where the shooting kept happening, dispossessed, angry, and living within sight of the country they had been moved out of. Petric district absorbed a large share of those refugees, and IMRO recruited from them heavily. Which means the men on that mountainside in 1925 were not abstract representatives of two governments. A meaningful number of them had personally lost a house on the other side of the line they were now guarding. That is the powder the dog wandered into. 48 hours to comply. The man in charge of Greece at that moment was General Theodoros Pangalos, and he is a genuinely spectacular piece of work. Pangalos had seized power in a coup in June 1925 and would declare himself dictator outright the following January. His actual record in office includes reintroducing the death penalty for a range of offenses, dissolving parliament, and issuing a decree specifying that women's skirts had to hang no more than 30 centimeters above the ground, with police empowered to measure them in the street with a ruler. That is not an exaggeration, and it is not a joke somebody made up later. There were officers with rulers. This was the man who received a report that Bulgarian troops had killed a Greek captain. Pangalos issued an ultimatum with a 48-hour deadline. Bulgaria was to punish whoever was responsible, deliver an official apology, and pay 2 million French francs in compensation to the families of the dead. Bulgaria's response was, by any reasonable standard, conciliatory. Sofia expressed regret, proposed a joint commission to investigate what had actually happened at the pass, and asked for the matter to be handled through the mixed border commissions that existed precisely for this. What Bulgaria would not do was accept sole guilt and hand over cash inside 2 days on the basis of one side's account of an incident with no witnesses. The deadline expired. On the 22nd of October, Greek forces crossed the border. They came in strength. Roughly 20,000 Greek troops moved into the Petric district against a Bulgarian force of about 10,000. And the Bulgarian force was under orders not to fight. Sofia had made a calculated decision. Resisting militarily would turn a border incident into a war Bulgaria could not win because the Treaty of Neuilly had capped its army at 20,000 men and forbidden it heavy artillery and an air force. Bulgaria was, by treaty, structurally incapable of defending itself. So instead of fighting, Bulgaria did something that in 1925 was still a fairly novel idea. It called the League of Nations. Greek troops occupied villages across the district and advanced toward the town of Petric itself, which was fortified and where a real battle would have produced real casualties. Somewhere between 50 and 121 Bulgarians died in the days of the occupation, depending on whose count you accept, and the Bulgarian figure notes that most of them were civilians rather than soldiers. Then, with the Greek assault on Petric town reportedly hours away, the order to stop arrived. The League actually worked. The League of Nations gets a bad historical reputation, most of it earned. It sat on its hands while Japan took Manchuria in 1931. It produced sanctions so carefully designed to be ineffective that Mussolini conquered Ethiopia through them in 1935. By 1939, it was a debating society with a nice building in Geneva, but in October 1925, for about a week, it worked exactly the way it was supposed to. The council convened in Paris, under the chairmanship of Aristide Briand, the French foreign minister, a man who had already been Prime Minister of France several times, and who would collect a Nobel Peace Prize that same year for the Locarno Agreements. Briand moved fast. The council demanded an immediate ceasefire and the withdrawal of all Greek forces to their own side of the border, and it made clear that Britain and France, which between them controlled the naval and financial levers that mattered to Greece, expected compliance. Greece complied. The troops pulled back. The whole occupation had lasted roughly 10 days. The League then sent a commission of inquiry, which examined the evidence and assigned the blame. Greece was ordered to pay Bulgaria £45,000 in reparations within 2 months, and the border was restored exactly as it had been. The Greeks were livid, and their complaint was not unreasonable. 2 years earlier, in 1923, an Italian general had been murdered on Greek soil, and Mussolini had responded by bombarding and occupying the island of Corfu. The League had wrung its hands. The great powers had shuffled the matter off to a conference of ambassadors, and the outcome was that Greece paid Italy 50 million lire and got no protection whatsoever. Now, when Greece did a smaller version of the same thing to a smaller country, the League discovered its spine overnight. The difference, of course, was Italy. Nobody in Paris or London was prepared to squeeze Mussolini in 1923. Squeezing Greece in 1925 cost nothing. The League's one great success in its early years is, when you turn it over and look at the underside, a demonstration of exactly the principle that would destroy it. Rules for the weak, negotiation for the strong. Pangalos did not last long. He was overthrown in August 1926 by another general, Georgios Kondylis, in a coup that took a matter of hours and met almost no resistance because by that point Pangalos had managed to alienate the army, the banks, the press, and every woman in Athens who owned a skirt. He spent time in prison, was eventually released, and lived long enough to see his country occupied in the next war. His hemline regulation outlived his government in the public memory, which feels correct. The reparations were paid. That is worth flagging, because in this entire video it is the only time anybody actually settles the bill. Greece handed over the £45,000, the troops went home, the border went back to where it had been, and the League of Nations spent the next few years pointing at the whole episode as proof of concept. 6 years later, Japan marched into Manchuria, and the concept stopped working forever. As for the dog, no record exists of what happened to it. It is entirely possible there was no dog. It is also possible that somewhere in the mountains above Petric in the autumn of 1925, there was a very confused animal, briefly the most consequential creature in southeastern Europe, wondering why everyone was shouting. Line item 4. 1 dog, ownership uncertain, existence disputed. Cost, up to 121 dead, a 10-day military occupation, and £45,000. Monsieur Remontel's ruined shop. Somewhere around 1832, in the town of Tacubaya, just outside Mexico City, a group of Mexican army officers went into a French pastry shop and behaved badly. The details depend on who is telling it. The French version, delivered by the owner, a chef remembered to history only as Monsieur Remontel, is that the officers ransacked the place, ate everything, smashed the fittings, destroyed his business. The Mexican version is considerably drier. The officers ate and then they left without paying the bill. Either way, Remontel wanted compensation. He went to the Mexican courts and got nowhere, which was a fairly standard experience in Mexico in the 1830s. So he did what expatriates have always done and complained to his own government. He asked for 60,000 pesos. His entire shop, building and stock and fittings included, was worth under 1,000. Now, a normal government receives a claim like that, looks at the numbers, laughs, and files it under nuisance. What Remontel had accidentally done was hand France a piece of paper at the exact moment France was looking for one. Because Mexico in the 1830s was a spectacular financial disaster. In the 15 years since independence, the country had run through more governments than most nations manage in a century. Presidents came in by coup and left by coup. The treasury was permanently empty. Mexico had borrowed heavily from British bankers and then defaulted, and it had a long record of unpaid claims from foreign merchants whose shops had been looted during whichever revolution happened to be passing through their neighborhood that year. There was a genuine list. In 1828, during a riot in Mexico City, the Parian market had been comprehensively sacked and a number of French-owned businesses destroyed. In 1837, a French citizen had been executed by Mexican authorities on a charge of piracy, which France did not accept. There were dozens of smaller claims from French bakers, tailors, and shopkeepers who had lost everything in one uprising or another and had never seen a peso. So in 1838, the French Prime Minister, Louis-Mathieu Mole, added it all up, applied whatever multiplier felt appropriate, and presented Mexico with a bill for 600,000 pesos. That is 3 million francs. It included Remontel's 60,000 for a bakery worth less than a 60th of that. Mexico looked at the number, correctly identified it as absurd, and refused to pay, which is how the whole business got its name. Mexicans called it La Guerra de los Pasteles, the pastry war, not because anyone in France cared about pastry, but because putting a bakery at the top of an invasion invoice is such an insulting thing to do that the insult became the title. The bill comes due. King Louis Philippe sent a fleet. The ultimatum expired in April 1838, and the French Navy began blockading Mexico's Gulf Coast, from the Yucatan all the way north to the Rio Grande. This was not a symbolic gesture. Mexico's government ran almost entirely on customs duties collected at its ports, and Veracruz was the biggest of them by a wide margin. Cutting off the Gulf Coast did not just inconvenience Mexican trade, it turned off the government's income. Merchants adapted, as merchants do. Goods started coming in overland through Texas, which had declared independence 2 years earlier and was extremely happy to profit from Mexico's problems. The blockade dragged on for months, cost Mexico a fortune, and produced no payment, because you cannot squeeze money out of a treasury that does not have any. In October, the French escalated. Admiral Charles Baudin arrived with a proper squadron and orders to force the issue. Negotiations at Jalapa failed. On the 27th of November, 1838, Baudin opened fire on San Juan de Ulua, the the massive coral stone fortress guarding the harbor at Veracruz. Ulua was supposed to be one of the strongest fortifications in the Americas. It had held out against a Spanish siege. It had walls thick enough to shrug off conventional cannonballs, which bounced off masonry all day without achieving much. Baudin had brought something new. The French squadron was equipped with Python's guns, which fired explosive shells on a flat trajectory instead of solid shot. The shells went into the stonework and detonated inside it. Ulua's defenses were reduced in a matter of hours, and the fortress surrendered the same day. That engagement is a bigger deal in military history than the war it belongs to. Naval officers around the world read the reports and understood, correctly, that the age of the wooden warship and the stone fort had just been handed an expiry date. Within 20 years, navies were armoring their ships in iron, and the direct line from Ulua runs through the Crimean War to the Monitor and the Merrimack. Mexico declared war on the 30th of November, which was, at that point, a formality performed on a country whose main harbor was already on fire. One detail gets left out of most retellings and deserves better. The men on the ground had already ended it. General Antonio Gaona signed the capitulation of the fortress on the 28th of November, and General Manuel Rincon, commanding the city, signed a matching convention for Veracruz. 2 days later, the government in Mexico City threw both agreements in the bin, declared a state of war, and handed command of Veracruz to Santa Anna. The officers who had actually been under the shells were overruled by politicians 250 miles inland who needed the fight to continue for domestic reasons. A funeral for a leg. Enter Antonio López de Santa Anna, who had been sitting out this crisis on his hacienda in Veracruz State, in political exile after losing Texas at San Jacinto and being generally blamed for the worst humiliation in Mexican history. A national emergency 30 miles from his front door was exactly what he needed. He rode into Veracruz, took command of whatever forces were available, and on the 5th of December, the French sent a landing party into the city with orders to capture him personally. They very nearly did. The story, repeated in Mexican and French accounts alike, is that Santa Anna escaped out of his own headquarters in his underwear, moments ahead of the soldiers sent to arrest him. He then did something genuinely brave or genuinely reckless, depending on your view of him. He gathered his men, counterattacked, and drove the French landing force back through the streets toward their boats. As the French withdrew, a shore gun, or a ship's gun, sources differ, fired grapeshot into the pursuing Mexicans. The blast killed Santa Anna's horse and shredded his left leg below the knee. The leg was amputated and buried at his hacienda. Santa Anna had won, in a narrow and local sense, and he immediately understood what he had been handed. He had gone into that morning as the man who lost Texas. He came out of it as a general who had bled for Mexico against a European invader. He wrote a farewell address from his sickbed, published nationwide, in the unmistakable voice of a man dictating his own monument. It worked. Within 3 years he was back in power, and in 1842, as president, he had the leg dug up. The exhumed limb was placed in an ornate coach and paraded to Mexico City. There was a procession, there were cannon salutes, there were poems written for the occasion and speeches delivered by senior officials, and at the end of it, the leg was interred beneath a monument in the Santa Paula Cemetery with full military honors, a state funeral, for a late, while its owner watched from the front row, alive, in a uniform. 2 years later, the country turned on him. In 1844, mobs pulled down his statues, and then they went to the cemetery, dug up the leg, tied a rope to it, and dragged it through the streets of Mexico City while shouting insults about the cripple. Santa Anna fled to Cuba. He came back. He always came back. He was president of Mexico 11 separate times, which is a number that should be checked twice because it does not look real. And by 1847, he was leading the army against an American invasion. At the Battle of Cerro Gordo, his position collapsed so quickly that he abandoned his carriage in the field, and inside it, the men of the 4th Illinois Volunteer Infantry found his prosthetic leg, cork, custom-made in New York, with a square-toed boot attached at the ankle. They kept it. It is in the Illinois State Military Museum in Springfield right now. Mexico has formally asked for it back more than once. Illinois has declined. The pastry war itself ended on the 9th of March, 1839, brokered by the British minister Richard Pakenham because Britain had enormous investments in Mexico and no interest in watching France strangle its debtor. Mexico agreed to pay the full 600,000 pesos. The French sailed away. The recorded casualties were modest by the standards of this list. Around 121 French killed or wounded, and 224 Mexican. Mexico never paid the 600,000 pesos. The real cost was not on the invoice anyway. The blockade wrecked Mexican customs revenue for the better part of a year, at exactly the moment Mexico needed money to hold its northern territories, while Texas spent that year trading freely and arming itself. 9 years later, the United States took everything from the Rio Grande to the Pacific, and one reason Mexico was in no financial condition to stop it is that a French fleet had spent 1838 sitting on its wallet over a bakery bill. Monsieur Remontel, for the record, appears to have received nothing at all. he walks into history to complain about his shop, and he walks straight back out of it, and nobody has any idea what became of him. The most consequential pastry chef of the 19th century does not even have a first name in the record. Line item 5. One looted pastry shop, appraised value under 1,000 pesos, claimed at 60,000. Cost: a naval bombardment, a wrecked fortress, roughly 345 casualties, one general's leg, and an invoice that is still outstanding after 187 years. The pole on Maiki Hill. The object in this one is a stick, a tall one, admittedly, a ship's spar planted on a hill above a harbor, but structurally speaking a stick with a flag on the end of it. Nobody was killed by the pole. Nobody was killed for the pole in any material sense. It had no strategic value whatsoever. Somewhere between 140 and 180 people died over it. The hill is Maiki Hill, above the town of Kororareka in the Bay of Islands at the top of New Zealand's North Island. Today it is called Russell, and it is a beautiful, sleepy, expensive little place full of cafes. In the 1840s, it was one of the roughest ports in the Pacific, a beach town servicing the whaling fleet, with a reputation so lurid that visiting missionaries called it the hellhole of the Pacific. Grog shops, brothels, and several hundred sailors ashore at any given time with money and no supervision. That town made a lot of people rich, and one of the people it made rich was Honheke Pokai, a chief of Ngapuhi, the most powerful iwi in the north. Heki was not some distant opponent of the British. He was the first chief to sign the Treaty of Waitangi in February 1840. He had been educated at a mission school, he was literate in 2 languages, he was married to the daughter of the great war chief, Hongi Hika, and he had actively wanted a relationship with the crown. The flagstaff on Maiki Hill flew the Union Jack, and according to several accounts Heke had personally supplied the spar it was made from. Then the deal turned out to be different from the one he thought he had signed. First, the capital moved. The British administration relocated south to Auckland in 1841, taking the officials and the business with it. Then came customs duties. Kororareka's entire economy ran on foreign ships, mostly American whalers, who came in to resupply and paid Maori for pigs, potatoes, timber, water, and labor. The new tariffs made the port expensive, and the ships simply stopped coming. Heki's income collapsed, and so did the income of everyone around him, and the cause was a piece of paper signed in a language most of them could not read. The American traders who remained were more than happy to explain to Heke that they had once had a similar arrangement with Britain involving taxes, and how they had resolved it. Then there was the flag itself. In 1835, 5 years before Waitangi, a confederation of northern chiefs had signed a Declaration of Independence and adopted their own flag, the flag of the United Tribes. Heke wanted that flag flown on Maiki Hill alongside the Union Jack. The British said no, only the Union Jack. So the pole stopped being a pole. Word went around, and the interpretation hardened. The flagstaff was the sign that Maori had become Tarakaraka, slaves, to a queen on the other side of the world. You do not need to agree with that reading to understand what happens next. Once enough people believe an object means something, the object means it. Chopped down 4 times. On the 8th of July, 1844, the flagstaff came down for the first time. Heke had intended to do it himself, and had been talked out of it by Archdeacon William Williams. So, a chief named Te Haratua of Pakaraka went up the hill and did it instead. The British put up a new one. On the 10th of January, 1845, Heke cut down the second one personally. The British put up a third, and this time they sheathed it in iron, on the reasonable theory that the problem was a man with an axe, and the solution was to make the axe useless. They finished the job on the 18th of January. It was on the ground the next morning. At this point, the situation had become something close to comedy for everyone except the officials responsible. Governor Robert Fitzroy, a genuinely interesting man who had captained the Beagle with Charles Darwin aboard, and who would later invent the modern weather forecast, was in an impossible position. He had almost no troops. He had no money. London had given him a colony and then declined to fund it. He convened a conference at the Te Waimate Mission in September 1844 and negotiated a peace that lasted a few months. Then he put up a 4th flagstaff, with a blockhouse and a guard around it, which was the closest thing to a declaration of intent available to him. On the morning of the 11th of March, 1845, Heke and his ally Te Ruki Kawiti came for it properly. Kawiti, an older and more experienced war leader, launched an attack on the southern end of Kororareka to draw the defenders away. It worked perfectly. While the Marines and armed settlers rushed south, Heke's men took the blockhouse on Maiki Hill, killed the guard, and cut down the 4th flagstaff. The battle that followed was a shambles. There is a strong argument that the British had effectively lost the town within an hour and only made it worse afterward, and the actual destruction of Kororareka was not a massacre but something stranger. The defenders, running low and demoralized, evacuated the civilian population onto ships in the harbor. A magazine exploded, apparently by accident, and gutted a section of the town. HMS Hazard shelled the beach, and then, over the following days, the place was systematically looted, by Heke's warriors and, according to multiple accounts, by sailors and settlers helping themselves on the way out. Contemporary counts put the dead at around 11 sailors, marines, and soldiers, and 13 civilians, with roughly 3 dozen wounded, though the figures vary between sources. What did not happen is a slaughter. Heke gave orders that the churches and the missionaries were not to be touched, and they were not. Non-combatants were allowed to leave. The most valuable trading town in New Zealand was destroyed, with a deliberate effort to avoid killing the people in it, which is not how most 19th-century colonial wars went, in either direction. The Pā That Ate Cannonballs. Britain sent soldiers, and the soldiers walked into something they were not prepared for. The traditional Maori pā was a hill fort built for pre-musket warfare, and against artillery it would have been a death trap. Kuwiti knew that, so he built something else. What he and Heke produced over the following months at Ohiawai and then Ruapikapeka is, by the assessment of a number of military historians, the earliest sustained example of modern field fortification anywhere in the world. The outer palisade was hung with bundles of green flax, which absorbed musket balls instead of splintering. Behind it sat a second and sometimes third line of heavy posts, with firing positions cut at ground level so defenders shot from below rather than standing exposed on a rampart. And underneath it all ran trenches and roofed bunkers deep enough for the garrison to sit out a bombardment and climb back to the firing line the moment the guns stopped. Cannonballs went into it and nothing happened. On the 1st of July, 1845, Colonel Henry Despard, having bombarded Ohiawai for days with no visible result, ordered a frontal assault on the palisade. It lasted somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. 33 men were killed, and 66 wounded out of an assaulting force of a couple of hundred, including Captain Grant and Lieutenant Philpotts. It was one of the most lopsided defeats a British force suffered anywhere in the 19th century, delivered by defenders who had built their fortress out of tree trunks, flax, and dirt. The final act was Ruapikapeka, the bat's nest, an even more elaborate work built specifically to be attacked. The British, now under Governor George Grey, brought overwhelming force, heavy naval guns, hundreds of regulars, and several hundred Maori allies under Tamati Waka Nene, who had backed the crown from the start and whose contribution to the British campaign is routinely underplayed. The siege ran from the 27th of December, 1845, to the 11th of January, 1846. When the British finally got inside, the Pā was mostly empty. Some accounts say the defenders had gone outside to pray on a Sunday and were caught out. Others, including a good deal of Maori testimony, say the whole thing was deliberate, that Kuwiti had built the Pā knowing he would eventually abandon it and had prepared positions in the bush behind it. The British lost 12 dead and 30 wounded, taking a fortification whose garrison had already decided to leave, and then the war just stopped. Total casualties across the 10 months run to roughly 82 British killed and 164 wounded, against Maori losses given by Heke and Kuwiti as around 60 killed and 80 wounded, though British estimates were higher. Nobody surrendered. No land was confiscated, which in the context of what happened in New Zealand over the following 30 years is remarkable. Heke and Kuwiti were both pardoned. Grey declared victory and quietly went home. The clearest verdict came from the missionary Henry Williams in May 1846, who noted that the flagstaff in the bay was still lying on the ground and the natives ruled there. It stayed down for 12 years. The British government, which had fought a war over that pole, never put another one up. In January 1858, a new flagstaff finally rose on Maiki Hill. It was erected by Maihi Parawan Kuwiti, the son of the man who had helped cut down the last one, on his own initiative and at his own expense, and he named it Waka Kota Hitanga, meaning being made one. It stands there today. Line item 6. 1 wooden spar. Cost, 1 destroyed town, roughly 150 to 180 dead. And a lesson in fortification that European armies would not fully absorb until the song. A captain loses an ear. In April 1731, off the coast of Florida, a British brig called the Rebecca was stopped and boarded by a Spanish Coast Guard vessel, the Isabella, commanded by a man named Juan de Leon Fandino. Fandino's men searched the ship for contraband. Accounts of what they found differ, which will be a running theme. What is agreed is that Fandino had the Rebecca's master, Captain Robert Jenkins, tied to the mast and then cut off his left ear. Then, according to the story, he handed it back and told Jenkins to take it to his king, and to tell him that Fandino would do the same to him if he dared to do the same. Jenkins sailed home with his ear. Understanding why a Spanish officer felt entitled to mutilate a British merchant captain requires understanding the single most poisonous commercial arrangement in the 18th century Atlantic, which is the Asiento. After the War of the Spanish Succession, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 handed Britain a prize that British negotiators considered enormous: the exclusive contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spain's American colonies, roughly 4,800 human beings a year, delivered by the South Sea Company under license from the Spanish crown. Attached to it was permission to send one merchant ship per year to trade general goods at the colonial fairs. The South Sea Company treated that one annual ship as an open door. The vessel would arrive, sell its cargo, and then be quietly restocked at night from other ships waiting offshore, so that a single legal hold produced an endless supply of goods. Everybody knew. Spanish colonial officials complained constantly. British merchants smuggled on an industrial scale alongside the company, and the Spanish government, which could not police thousands of miles of Caribbean coast with a navy it did not have, licensed private captains to do it instead. Those were the guarda-costas, armed, privately motivated, paid out of what they seized, and operating on an evidence standard best described as vibes. A British ship carrying so much as a Spanish coin could be declared a smuggler and taken, so there were dozens of Jenkinses, ships seized, cargoes confiscated, crews beaten and occasionally maimed. British merchants had been petitioning Parliament about it for years and getting nowhere, because the Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, had built his entire 20-year career on not fighting expensive wars. Jenkins reported the incident. It went into a file. Nothing happened. For 7 years. 7 years, in a jar. In March 1738, a committee of the House of Commons summoned Captain Robert Jenkins to testify about Spanish depredations, and the ear came back. The image everyone knows is Jenkins standing before Parliament, unwrapping a jar, and holding up a shriveled piece of human cartilage, while honorable members recoil. It is one of the most vivid scenes in British political history, and it may be substantially invented. No record of Jenkins actually testifying survives in the Commons journals. Some historians think he appeared and produced the ear. Others think he was summoned and never came, and that the whole tableau was manufactured afterward by people who understood that a jar makes a better argument than a spreadsheet. What is not in doubt is what the ear was for. Walpole's opponents, the merchant lobby and the group of ambitious politicians, known as the Patriot Whigs, wanted a war with Spain. They wanted Spanish colonial trade broken open. They wanted Walpole out, and they needed the public angry. An ear in a jar does that. 7 years of confiscated cargo manifests do not. The campaign worked spectacularly. Public opinion caught fire. Walpole tried to defuse it with the Convention of El Pardo in January 1739, under which Spain agreed to pay £95,000 in compensation. The deal collapsed almost immediately, partly because the South Sea Company flatly refused to pay a counterclaim of £68,000 it owed the Spanish crown, which meant the company that had caused the entire crisis also killed the settlement of it. George II declared war on the 15th of June, 1739. Parliament ratified it on the 23rd of October. London went delirious. Church bells rang across the city. Crowds celebrated in the streets. Walpole, who had been dragged into this by a public he could not control and a press he could not buy, listened to the bells and reportedly said that they were ringing them now, and would soon be wringing their hands. Round 1 went beautifully. Admiral Edward Vernon sailed for the Caribbean, and in November 1739, attacked Portobello on the Panama coast with 6 ships of the line. The town fell inside 24 hours. Britain lost its mind. Vernon became a national hero on a scale that is hard to convey. Medals were struck. Taverns were renamed. A road in West London was named after the victory and is now Portobello Road, along with Portobello in Edinburgh and Portobello in Dublin. The song Rule Britannia was written in that wave of patriotic feeling and first performed in 1740. Vernon also, in 1740, ordered the Navy's rum ration diluted with water to stop his sailors drinking themselves into uselessness. He habitually wore a coat made of a coarse fabric called grogram, which had earned him the nickname Old Grog, and the diluted rum inherited it. That is where grog comes from. One admiral, one bad reputation for cheap coats, one permanent addition to the English language. Then Britain decided to finish the job and went to Cartagena. Cartagena killed 6,000. The force sent against Cartagena de Indias in March 1741 was the largest amphibious operation the world had ever seen, and would remain so until the Second World War. 186 ships, more than 2,600 guns, over 27,000 men, of whom around 10,000 were the landing force. Among them were roughly 3,600 colonial troops raised in British North America, and one of them was a Virginian officer named Lawrence Washington, who came home so impressed with his commander that he named his estate on the Potomac after him. That estate passed to his younger half-brother George. Mount Vernon is named after the admiral who lost this battle. Defending Cartagena was Blas de Lezo, who by 1741 had been assembled out of spare parts. He had lost a leg to a cannonball at Gibraltar at 17, an eye at Toulon, and the use of an arm at Barcelona. The Spanish called him Medio Hombre, the half-man. He had 6 ships of the line and roughly 3,600 soldiers and militia against a force 8 times his size. He also had walls, forts arranged in depth, a harbor with a single narrow entrance, and the calendar. The siege lasted 67 days. The British forced the harbor entrance and took the outer forts, at cost. Then they came up against the inner defenses, most importantly the hill fort of San Felipe de Barajas, and on the night of the 20th of April they attacked it with scaling ladders. The ladders were too short. The assault columns were caught on the slope in daylight and cut apart. And while all this was happening, the rains came, and with them, yellow fever. Disease did what Blas de Lezo could not have managed on his own. The British fleet became a floating hospital. Men died faster than they could be counted. When Vernon finally withdrew in May, roughly 6,000 British dead were left behind against about 1,000 Spanish, and the overwhelming majority of the British losses were not from Spanish fire but from mosquitoes and dysentery in a crowded anchorage in the tropics. The best detail, and it is genuinely one of the greatest own goals in the history of public relations, is that Britain had already minted the commemorative medals. Confident of victory, the mint had produced medals showing Blas de Lezo kneeling in surrender before Admiral Vernon, with the legend that the pride of Spain had been humbled. They show a 2-legged, 2-armed, 2-eyed man kneeling. They were distributed. They exist in museum collections. They commemorate a defeat. Blas de Lezo did not enjoy his triumph. He was blamed by the viceroy for the damage to the city, fell out of favor at court, and died in September 1741 of an illness he picked up during the siege. He was buried in an unmarked location. Spain took over 200 years to build him a statue. The war rolled on and then dissolved into the much larger War of the Austrian Succession, which swallowed it whole after 1742. Fighting spread to Georgia and Florida, where James Oglethorpe failed to take St. Augustine and then held off a Spanish invasion at Bloody Marsh. It formally ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, and in 1750 Britain sold the Asiento back to Spain for £100,000. The trading right that started the entire catastrophe was quietly liquidated for barely more than the compensation Spain had offered before a shot was fired. Casualty estimates for the war run to roughly 20,000 British and 10,000 Spanish dead, most of them from disease. The name, by the way, is not contemporary. Nobody in 1739 called it the War of Jenkins' Ear. That title is usually credited to Thomas Carlyle, who coined it in the 1850s, more than a century after the fact, while writing about Frederick the Great. Nobody knows what happened to the ear. Line item 7. 1 human ear. Retail value 0. Cost, approximately 30,000 dead. The final receipt. 1 soup kettle. 1 black boar. 1 oak bucket. 1 dog that possibly never existed. 1 pastry shop. 1 wooden spar. 1 left ear. Total retail value at time of incident, being extremely generous about the pig, comfortably under $200 in today's money. Total cost. Somewhere around 35,000 dead. 1 incinerated New Zealand port town. 1 shattered Mexican fortress, 1 general's leg with its own state funeral and its own separate riot, 12 years of joint military occupation, on a potato island, several million guilders, 45,000 pounds sterling, 1 national anthem, 1 word for watered-down rum, and 1 commemorative medal celebrating a victory that did not happen. Of those 7 bills, exactly 1 was ever settled. Greece paid for the dog. France quietly covered part of the kettle to make Joseph go away. Everything else is still outstanding. Mexico owes France 600,000 pesos and has owed it since 1839. Bologna would still like its bucket. Illinois is not giving the leg back. The thing worth noticing is not that people will die over objects. It is that in every single one of these stories, the object was the cheapest item in the room. The bucket, the pig, the ear, these were the only things on any of these invoices that anybody involved could actually afford. Everything else, the fleets and the fortresses and the men, cost more than the entire dispute was worth before the first shot was fired. And every single person making the decision knew it. They kept the bucket. It is in a tower in Modena, with the humidity controlled. They kept the leg. It is in a glass case in Springfield, Illinois. Nobody kept the ear.